technical reason. Okay, it's
now
recording.
it's recording.
I don't know. I'm still here.
Finally. So welcome everyone to the next today's Storybook office hours. And we have some exciting stuff to tell you today. We have Yann Braga on board, who's telling you about the new interactive story beta. And Yann Braga is a Chromatic team member since this year, I think. He's also a Storybook maintainer, created Storybook testing React, and was involved in the today's topic. And we also have a special guest, Gerd, who's also part of the Chromatic team. Hi, Gerd. And yeah, Yann, how are you?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm doing well. Kind of got a cold. Fortunately, it's not COVID, so it's fine. So if I cough sometimes, sorry for that.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and talk about Storybook, as always. And especially the interactions feature is really exciting. To be honest, Gert is actually the one who built most of it. I was just there at the end. But yeah, I think most of us already use Storybook in their projects. If there is anyone who does not already, well, essentially Storybook is a developer tool that works as a workshop for UI development, and that helps you build components in isolation, which is really helpful when you're working, especially in bigger projects. So I just wanted to ask any of you, were you ever in a situation where you needed to develop a small component like a button or a small form, but like in a checkout page? So in order to reach that page, you have to run the mocks, you have to run the server, you have to spin up Docker instances, you need to run the app, and then you need to find the correct user to log in certain conditions, only to get to that page. But damn it, you only cared about the button. Why do you need to do all of that to get there, right? So Storybook kind of helps you a lot with that. And I don't have slides or anything prepared. I'm just going to do improvisation. I hope you don't mind. Let me share my screen and talk about that story. No pun intended. So let's see. I have a project, a pet project called Meal Drop. And it's essentially an application to order food. So in order to get to the end, I need to, for instance, let's say, go to a category page. Here I have a few components. Once I select the category, I go to a list of restaurants, and then I can go to the detail of that restaurant, and I need to interact with the page, add some stuff to my carts, go to the sidebar, and then from there, go to the checkout. I need to fill my forms. And then once this is complete, I go into the success page. But what if I just need to work on this component? Why do I need to do all of that flow, right? Well, thankfully, I use Storybook. So my Storybook contains 100% of the components used here. So I have a easy way to visualize every single component and every UI state there is of my app without having to even run the application. Now, I know that pretty much everyone knows that Storybook is a platform to help build component libraries. However, that is not necessarily just the purpose of Storybook, because if you can build a component in isolation, it does not necessarily need to be a badge component or a button component. It can actually be an entire feature or an entire form, for instance. So an example of talking about forms, I have this multi-step form, which I have entirely in Storybook, and I can play around with it without having to go to the checkout page. But also, I can have the checkout page and the different flows of my checkout page. That also includes full pages like the home page. So inside of Storybook, I'm actually able to visualize the entire page of my app. And of course, the pages are more complicated to add to Storybook because essentially they are connected components which might do data fetching. They might have routing mechanisms. They might have some state providers and such, state managements. So once all of that setup is done, then you can actually have all of them on Storybook. And it is really helpful because, first of all, you can do lots of interesting things with add-ons. For instance, there is the add-on for accessibility. So this is very useful for designers. For instance, what if the people using my app, they have some visual deficiencies, right? So if my app is blurry, does the UI still show what's intended to be? What about people that don't see all the colors? Is my application still telling what it has to tell? And there are many other things. As an example, this application has dark mode and light mode. So in Storybook, I can directly see that, but I can even do better. I can have both of the themes side by side and compare how my app looks in those. And I'm pretty sure that the designers, like, they get crazy over this because it's really incredible. But anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to show you the new feature from Storybook called add-on interactions. So given that, for example, I have the ability to put a page here, what if I want to interact with the page, right? Because in Storybook, it's pretty known that you have components that you can pass properties like inputs to change them. So for instance, this button can be disabled. It can be a clear without the background. It can have an icon or an icon in a text. But those properties, they normally come from Storybook sending as arts, as we call them. And you can play with them on controls, right? This everybody is kind of used to already. So I can basically toggle all of these variants and make sure that they make sense and work with my component. However, once you get into a more complex situation, such as a form, so for instance, in the, where was it? The checkout page? Yeah, such as a form, then you can't really pass properties like, oh, initial value for the first name, initial value for the last name, because it's not really a great pattern. The only way to actually get different states of it is to actually use interactions. So let me show you an example of a page that, where is it? Restaurant detail page. Okay, so this is a page of which I have different states, but in order to reach them, I need to interact with the page. So I want to click on a element to open a model, and I want to add it to my cart. And then maybe I want to click on the sidebar and I want to change the value of it. And then I want to check whether the changes made sense between the components, so that, for instance, my state management tool is actually properly synchronizing the data. How do I do all of these things? There is an add-on called interactions, and I'm actually gonna switch to a simpler example to kind of like show you how to do that, and then I will go back to show a more complex usage of it. But I am here using a form component in my Angular stories, and as you can see, it's pretty much simple. I can type something and the state changes so that this field is validated. If I delete it, I get a validation message. I cannot click on submit because it's not filled. So all of these states, I want to actually add them to Storybook. So let's do that. I'm just going to put this to the side, and I'm going to put my code on the right. So here's a form called Here Form, and it's got the stories. And hopefully you are used to the templates system here. So essentially, I have a standard story, which is really just a component with the default values. So in order to add some interactions to it, first of all, I'm going to create a story. And let's just say that I want a story that fills the fields. So I'm going to call it fill. And the add-on interactions actually works with a new mechanism from Storybook 6.4 called the play function. So in order to have it, you just do your story name.play, which is an asynchronous function that gets executed after the component is rendered. So essentially, you can do, let's just say I'm going to do alert hello world. And once I save this, and this component creates a new story, you see that my alert is executing. So we take that to the next level by, instead of just doing these kind of things, we actually interact with the component. And there are various ways of interacting with components. I know that in Angular, there are multiple solutions, like people use testbed, or maybe they use Spectator, but people are also using testing library, for instance. And testing library is a very interesting piece of software that we are investing at the moment with other interactions. So let's use it to do some interaction with this component. So the play function provides me a context, and this context contains a bunch of properties. One of the properties is called canvas element, which is essentially a wrapper to my story. So I can use that wrapper to actually apply my queries on top of. So let me just do the following. So I'm going to create a canvas, which is a result of my context.canvas element. And I want testing library to get information from that and paste that into canvas. So first of all, there is a utility method called within from testing library. However, all of these, okay, let me use that from testing library. And then once I execute this, what will happen is canvas will contain the element that wraps all of my form. And then from there, I can use canvas to query elements and do some interactions on top of it. So for instance, the first thing that I can do is I can use canvas.get by role. And then the role should be a text box so that I'm looking for these inputs. And because I want to target one specific one, which is the name input, I'm just going to do pass a name property. And I want to get name. And I'm going to assign this to a variable. I'm just going to call it a name field. And now that I have the reference to that field, what I want to do is I want to interact with it. So testing library also provides something called user event. And user event has an API to do a bunch of stuff. So in this case, I want to type into my name field, let's just say Storm from X-Men. And I'm going to save this, and hopefully this will work. Okay, so there you go. This works. But the thing is, this is getting executed, and I want even more information about it, because at the very moment, we're not even using any add-ons. We're just using the play function. But Storybook has this add-on panel that contains a bunch of stuff that it's helpful. It's got also this new thing called interactions. So once I click on it, what I see is that there are no interactions, which is pretty odd because I am interacting with my component. Well, the thing is, add-on interactions has internal mechanisms that rely on using certain syntaxes in certain Storybook libraries. And in this moment, I'm actually not using them. And as you can see, I'm getting some wiggly code right here, which is telling me that there's something odd. Together with add-on interactions, we're also releasing a ESLint plugin to help you circumvent having issues like just that. So in an example of that, I am seeing that it says I should not be using testing library directly. I should be importing this from Storybook testing library. And I can actually click on quick fix. And then once I do it, it's changing my imports. The same goes for user event. So I'm just going to also import it from the same library here. And once this problem is fixed, I have yet another one, which is this here at the bottom. It says the interaction should be awaited. And the reason for that is that the auto interactions has some interesting mechanisms, which I'm going to show you really soon, that allows you to go back and forth with your interactions. But in order for that to work, you need to be awaiting every interaction that you do. So I'm also going to use the quick fix functionality from the linter, and just going to let the linter fix this for me. So once I save this and I run my story again, what you can see is that now in the auto interactions panel, I have very interesting information. So first of all, I've got pretty much the query which I wrote for the interaction right on the browser. And I can even go further with it, because now I have these interesting buttons here. So basically, my component rendered, plus it executed an interaction on top of it. So if I click on go back, I'm actually going to the previous state of my component, and I can go further again to re-execute that interaction. And that for me is kind of mind-blowing, because when using testing libraries such as the ones related to CLI, like testing library, for instance, normally it is a great experience when you're writing the tests itself, but sometimes it's pretty tricky when there's a problem, because you have to somehow parse the text in the CLI with your mind and kind of draw what's going on, and sometimes that's just not helpful. And being able to have the same developer experience while writing your tests, however, getting the visual experience from the browser, for me, it's just like the perfect combination. And that's basically what Storybook is doing that here for us with add-on interactions. So let's go ahead and just do something similar for the other fields. So for instance, the alter ego of the field, so alter ego field. This is also a text box. I'm just going to change to alter ego. And Storm is actually called Aurora Monroe. This is her alter ego. And I'm going to execute this as well. So basically now in my panel, I have two interactions, and these two are selected. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to do, a bunch more interactions. So I'm just going to copy stuff that I already have done, of course, to essentially also select an option from a dropdown. So at the very moment, we have a story, which is standard, and that essentially just renders the form. And now we have a story called filled with these interactions. So first of all, I don't even need to look at the code anymore. I can just look here. So the first interaction is it's going to select my field and type Storm. The other one is select another field and type Aurora Monroe, and then select an option. So now I see easily how my form looks like when it's in the filled state. So if I just finish my work right now, I'm able to show for non-technical people that my form has two states, the filled and the standard, and I can just select them. And please don't mind about the flickering thing. It's just that this component uses Bootstrap, which is like downloading every single time I run the story. Don't mind about that. So this is very interesting. However, I also want to show just a couple more examples. So what if I have validated fields that need to be selected, right? So let's just say that I want to create a new story, which is maybe invalid fields or something. So this is a story, and let me scroll a bit up. Yeah, this is a story of my hero form, which is a clone of my template. So I'm just going to use this syntax. And essentially, my invalid field story also has a play property, right? Which receives a context. It's a synchronous function. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to do pretty much the same as the previous story, which fills everything. And by the way, let me just save this so I can have it on my left side. So I want to fill the values, and I want to delete them, so that the form is in a dirty state and it can trigger the validation. So now you tell me like, oh, okay. So I guess I just copy paste all of these things here. And from there, I do an interaction, right? So let's just say that, well, I typed name field and I want to clear the value from it. So I'm just going to await user event dot clear my name field. And if I just do that in the invalid field story, it's going to execute the 3 steps we had before. Plus, it's going to clear the field so I get this validation. However, we're talking about improving developer experience. So we don't want people to copy paste the same thing multiple times. But the magic is, given that my story, the previous story, had a play function, what if I can just execute that one instead? Because I know that it's going to do pretty much what I'm looking for, right? So let me take all of these things away. And let me just refer to the play function from my field story. And I'm going to execute it by passing a context, which I also have from my play function. So I'm essentially just passing it down. And because this is an interaction, I also need to await it. So by doing that, well, at the moment, I don't have a reference to the name field, which means that I just essentially need to get it in my thing right here. But I also don't have the canvas reference anymore. So I can also just get that reference right here. Or maybe just put it at the bottom. So essentially what this will do is it will execute all of the previous interactions from the filled story plus some extra. And right now, we now have a standard filled and invalid fields story. And this is very interesting because now I'm actually able to interact with the component in all possible states that I have. And these states are going to be useful to document the UI even further, right? Normally, Storybook allows you to pass properties to components, which allows you to cover certain parts of your UI. But now that you can interact, I think you can even cover 100% of your UI states right now. So this is pretty interesting. But you can also tell me that, well, with testing library, I'm not only able to interact with components, I'm also able to assert things, for instance. So what if I want to assert that in the invalid state, I actually have an element which says name is required? Well, let's try to do that. So I'm going to try to get an element. So let's say error validation. And I'm going to use canvas.getByText. And I'm just going to type that. So I get this error validation, and I want to do something with it, right? Now, normally in the CLI, in jest tests, for instance, or Karma or whatever, you have to assert things, right? And normally you use expect. So what if I do something like expect my element to actually not be null? So if the element is not null, then it actually exists, right? However, I'm running this in the browser, and expect actually comes from a node. So how is this possible? Well, actually, it's not possible. And that's why the linter is also complaining, saying that I should not use expect directly. I should use the one from the package Storybook Jest. So essentially, together with all of these other packages, we're also providing a browser-enabled version of Jest that you can use in your browser. So I'm just going to fix this problem. I'm going to allow ESLint to fix it. And it fixed it by importing right here. And this interaction as well should be awaited so that we can also see them properly in the add-ons panel. And I'm going to save this right now. Let's see what happens. So the interaction is also happening at the bottom. And it says, basically with the check mark, it says that it passed. So what if I flip it? So I'm actually expecting the element to be there, or actually to not be there. So essentially I'm getting the failure right here, and I get these really interesting visual states. So even if I were to not have the interactions selected, I can still see that there's a failure. And this gives me the perspective of, okay, so this execution is failing for certain reasons. And you basically get the same output that you get in the CLI. And I find this amazing because if you get that, you can combine with so many things. So I'm just going to copy another example, which I have, so that I can show you something a bit more complex, but I don't want to take too much time. So I'm just gonna save this. Yeah, there you go. So essentially, I had previous stories to fill the form, and now I want to submit the form. And by submitting the form, let me show you how this actually does normally. So once I have a hero and I submit it, it takes like a second, and it goes to this success page. This actually means that, there are asynchronous stuff happening, and I might need to wait for something to happen. So in this example, for the submitted story that I want to create, I will fill the form, and then, I will click on the submit button, and I'm going to use the wait for utility from testing library to expect the heading element that says you submitted the following to exist, as well as to expect the text context of every single element here to match with the one that I'm looking for. So if I select the submitted story now, and let me show you, yeah. So it actually does everything plus the assertions. So this is very interesting because, I can now refer to my interactions in the UI and use this as a way to test basically all of my flows. And I'm not able to only do that, but I can also go back and forth in my interactions, or maybe I can just click on one specifically and my interactions execute up to that point. And then I can go back and forth, or I can go directly to the end of my execution. So this gives me a lot of interesting information, but essentially, not only now I have the props, which I can, the art, which I can put to different edge cases for my components based on the properties that it receives. But now I also have all of the interactions, which allow me to cover pretty much all the rest of the UI states. So just to finalize, I'm going to come back to my previous example, because in this example, I had pages, which were also rendered in isolation. But I thought, well, the add-on is something very interesting that actually allows me to maybe do an end-to-end flow. Let's try that. So I actually managed to add the entire application in Storybook. So this is the same app which is running over here. The difference is that in this case, this is using the actual backend. And in Storybook, I'm actually mocking it using mock service worker. And I'm actually able to interact with everything and do the whole navigation in it. But I don't want to do that. I want Storybook to do that for me. So I created one story per flow of my app. And every time that I click on them, and let me put the interactions panel right here. Every time that I click on these interactions, I see them listed on the side. So it kind of seems like I am not navigating because it's so fast, but that's actually the case. These interactions are happening. And by the way, the interactions panel has two modes. One is the interactions debugger. The other one is just visualizing it. And the interactions debugger is actually currently experimental, so it's under a flag, which I forgot to enable. So let me just enable it right away in the browser. I can also click on this button here that re-executes the interaction. So, okay, now I have these things, right? So I can actually, go back and see that I was in the home page, and then I clicked on view all restaurants, and then I click on, for instance, burgers, and then I go to these. So I have a story called end to end, which essentially does everything. But this doesn't actually give me an overview of what the flow exactly is, unless I actually have to be clicking on them. And as you can see on the right panel, there are just a lot of steps. So this is just an experiment that I'm going to show you right now, but it's inspired by one of the community members, which created some sort of way to visualize these steps happening as we go. So I created this example called demo mode. I'm going to toggle it to true, and I'm going to come back to my interactions, and I'm going to rerun this. So this is how you would see a better way of having the interactions, right? So I'm visualizing exactly what is going on and where the mouse is going to be and where it is clicking and what it's doing. And on the right side, I see my interactions as well as the assertions. So how awesome is this? Like, I wouldn't even think that Storybook was able to do such thing. And I already thought Storybook was amazing. So now that it actually is able to do all of these, yeah, I mean, it's just incredible because Storybook is a self-contained application that you can publish, right? And as you can see here, I'm using Chromatic to make my meal drop Storybook available. And I can just click on this button and I can get the story and send to people. They don't need to have anything installed in their machines. They can open this on their mobile phones. They can open it on their browsers in whatever computer they have. And this is great because it cuts the restrictions that make people not able to understand why there are broken flows and debug things as they go. And it's incredible because, for instance, I could even just open my dev tools. I can check what's going on in my logs, but I could also search for my code right here, add a debugger or a breakpoint in my console dev tools, and then make sure that the data is actually going correctly. So if you actually get all of this, plus, for instance, a tool like Chromatic, which automatically runs all of these tests in your stories, every single time that you make changes in your project and you open a pull request, all of these checks will run automatically. So in my case, for instance, my end-to-end, every single time I make a new feature, will rerun these interactions. And if something fails during here, because as you can see, there are also expect calls right here, just to make sure that my state management is working correctly and the elements are behaving as they should. If this fails, Chromatic will tell me, and I actually have a link that goes right into the story. So I don't need to see videos. I don't need to see text and try to understand in the logs what's going on, because I can actually just click on a link and reproduce the actual bug. And for me, that's just fantastic. So that's basically what I wanted to show you. And I wanted to, invest some time in actually discussing about it. It's a feature that is pretty much experimental. We are really excited to share about it. It's going to be part of Storybook 6.4. You can actually access it right now in the release candidate version. And we have so much more to work on and so much. Oh, thanks a lot, Gert. Really nice to have you. And there are so many plans to make it even better. But I just wanted to share with you. And also, maybe I can already answer one question if it's my question, actually. Well, does it work with multiple frameworks? In the example I showed you, I showed you a React project and an Angular project. So the thing is that I'm using testing library from Storybook, which is actually based on testing library DOM. So that is a framework agnostic solution. So that should work pretty much with most, if not all, of the frameworks.
Nice. Before we head over to the questions, and we have a lot of them, I must say, based on the chat, people's mind is blowing, and mine is too. This is a really nice feature to have. Honestly, for our own project, I thought about adding Cypress to Storybook. Maybe I now move over to actually write my play functions instead. Let's see. And yeah, thank you for this amazing presentation. Just yesterday, Yann asked me if he has to prepare some slides or something, and I thought, oh no, just come with a small demo or something like that. And now he's talking for 35 minutes now, or 30 minutes, with a mind-blowing demonstration of this new feature. Honestly, great job on presenting this to us. I think we all got a good picture of what this could mean to our project.
Thank you.
We're so excited.
Yeah, maybe let's head over to the questions. A lot of them have been answered in the chat, but I guess telling them again in voice is a better way. So let's start with Ankita, who has asked, is the name being passed actually the label label text that shows up? Does it need to be the form field name properly? So
actually, good question. So thing is, with the other interactions, we're not really creating new syntaxes. We're just reusing the ones from testing library. So essentially, whatever you get from the documentations of testing library, you can just follow. And I like the thing I like about testing library is that it kind of forces you to think on a more accessible way of querying elements. So instead of like querying per ID or class names or whatever, you actually have to query by some like role or a label text. And if you don't have those, you're kind of forced to add them. And essentially, in the end, your elements are more accessible. And I really think that it's so important because we are very privileged to be able to see what we're consuming, but not everybody can do that, right? There is a huge amount of people which rely solely on screen reader softwares, and I'm pretty sure that most people don't really test those when they're implementing their features. So yeah, what if you're making a purchase flow in an e-commerce and if people can't just go through it by using just a keyboard and a screen reader, right? What if there's a modal and the modal is not accessible, so people can't actually change the focus to the modal? Essentially, you are, in a way, you are breaking a flow that would not allow a person to make a purchase. So I always like to think of these flows as something that I can relate. So I think like, okay, so if this is not accessible, maybe somebody will not be able to buy their Christmas gift for their granddaughter. And like, how sad is that, right? I don't want that to happen. So I always try to make things more accessible. And that's why I really like testing library.
Nice. And Sandra asked a really good question. I don't need to tell all those questions. Sandra, ask your question yourself. You asked about a headless run, I think.
Yeah, in GitLab or any other CI environment, can I just run the tests basically from this thing without having the interaction piece?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good question, and it seems like a logical next iteration of what we're just releasing. And the answer is, at the moment, you cannot. So you really rely on running Storybook, executing and accessing the stories for the interactions to happen. However, we are currently working on a test runner, which will allow you to just get that. So essentially, the idea is to automatically run all your tests using Playwright in a headless mode. So then you can essentially get this smoke test setting in your CI with like super easy configuration. But it's something that we're working on. So expect that to in the upcoming releases of Storybook, basically.
Cool.
And Ronan, you had a question.
Yeah. Can you run them in parallel, the tests? I know, like with our pipeline, it's kind of important when you have lots of tests and libraries.
Yeah. So essentially, when you're saying pipeline, you still also mean similarly to what Sander asked, which at the moment is not a feature that we provide. So once we do have the test runner, ideally, yes, you should be able to get the features that Jest provides, for instance. So you should be able to run things in band, or you should be able to run them in parallel. It's really up to the configuration from actually like a test runner like Jest.
Right.
And hopefully you would get all of that basically out of the box.
Okay, I know with Cypress we had issues because it actually loads the UI on a port, and if you're running multiple libs in like a monorepo, say, port 4200 is only accessible like at one time. I don't know if you've thought about that kind of thing, being able to pick random ports to run multiple tests.
I can probably answer that. They just told us that they are going to use Playwright. Playwright is the same thing as Puppeteer. They can open like multiple tabs at the same time, so they can visit multiple pages. So it's really depending on the setup of your CI/CD, how many of those things will easily work in parallel. For Scully, I check how many processors there are available and run that many.
Okay.
Yeah,
I know
thanks, Ender.
for one app it might be fine, but if you have 3 different apps, you might need different ports. That should be possible, yeah.
Yeah, when we get there, it would be really actually helpful to have your example, maybe as an alpha tester, because we should really strive for an accessible solution for everyone. And I guess your is kind of like an edge case, so it's great to have you here. Maybe we could you could reach out later on Discord community, so we can get you to better test those things.
Yeah, sounds good.
Don't forget, we have a Storybook channel, which is a great place for early adopters to hang out.
Awesome.
And the Storybook team helps out. I don't know if the whole Storybook team is in there yet, but I know we have Kai and Mark.
A lot.
And they're super, super helpful, and we do have some really good questions in there.
Matteo.
These conversations are so cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering the same about performance and this test runner. I hope it has the way to manage that. And yeah, I remember an article talking about having the test connected to the stories. So in this case, the story has the whole test inside, and we run the test runner. It will be able to execute them inside the stories and nothing else.
Yeah, essentially the interactions, they happen because of the play function, and the play function happens because once the component is rendered by Storybook executes the play function. So essentially, you would need to have Storybook running. You would need to visit the story so that it can render the story and execute the interaction. So solutions like running on a headless browser with Playwright allows you to visit each of these stories, get the result of them, and assert whether your component ran the interactions correctly, or if there was a failure during the interaction steps.
I was wondering if there is the possibility to not have too much Storybook overhead, but anyways, the nice stuff is that we can test live, right? We can see the interactions live, and that's a big plus. The only con is the performance, maybe with the overhead.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly performance implications in case your project contains maybe 5 apps with 200 components each, and then your Storybook maybe has 1,000 stories or something like that. But I guess when you get into those situations, you can either choose to use your own infrastructure, or you can use services like Chromatic, for instance, that is a cloud-based provider that basically does all of that at their own infrastructure, which is pretty fast and performant. So then you kind of don't need to rely too much about that. Chromatic takes care of that for you, for instance. But yeah, I mean, there are multiple projects which we're working on at the moment to improve performance in Storybook. There has been a complete rewrite in Storybook 6.4 in how the stories are managed, so that now every component can actually be lazy loaded. So that certainly helps in terms of performance. And there's also a movement on the new bundlers and builders, so that you can actually, instead of using Webpack, maybe you want to use Vite or some ES build related builder. So there's a lot of work on that, and I'm pretty sure that over the next releases, Storybook is always going to get more performant. But if you have a pretty complex setup in your project using a bunch of things which just takes time to compile, then it's likely that you might get it might take some time to build. But I think it's part of the process.
Yeah, thanks for the great stuff.
No worries.
We have 9 more minutes. Oh, Ankita, you have a question.
Yeah, I have a couple of them actually. I was playing around with the link that you shared for Chromatic, and I don't see the play buttons that you had showing up under interactions.
Yeah, actually, so that's what I mentioned. I'm sorry that there is a feature toggle. Let me show you this. I think it's really quick.
It's because it's brand new, Ankita.
Yeah.
I want it all, Bonnie. I'm impatient.
Yeah.
Okay, so essentially, once you have so there's a blog post that I'm going to share with all of you, and you can follow. But basically, once you have the add-on interactions installed in your project, in your main JS, in order to get the play buttons, you actually have to enable that feature. So your main JS is just an exported object, and then you need to add features interactions debugger equals true. You can get this information in the repository of add-on interactions. And in order to kind of circumvent that, there's this nice little hack. So if I open my browser, I can access features. And that's essentially the object that contains things. So I can type interactions debugger equals true. So if I do that and I go into a story that contains, for instance, this one that has this play button, then I get the options basically. So, but yeah, ideally that would not be necessary. However, because the debugger is the most experimental feature in that add-on, we're essentially having that under a feature flag because it's essentially still under development. We still need to polish it and really, really well so that we can actually release it as default.
So right now I will be able to play all the tests, like have the interaction work on all my stories, but just not have. That's fine. I can live with that. And another thing that I noticed that you had that side by side for your themes. I don't see that. What add-on is that? I don't have that when I use the theme add-on.
Yeah, so that's kind of like the magic of Storybook. Storybook is just initially very plain, and then you're able to augment its functionality either by adding add-ons or actually creating decorators of your own. So in the example that I have, which has multiple themes, I actually created that myself. And it's pretty simple to think about. So if your component is essentially a wrapper that contains your component, you can create a decorator that wraps your component but gets the information of the theme you want to render and then passes down to that wrapper. Okay, so if I create a decorator that gets the theme and renders a component, I can essentially render a dark mode and a light mode. But wait a second. What if my decorator, instead of having one wrapper, actually it clones it so that it has 2 wrappers and each wrapper contains 1 theme? So that's all I did actually. Instead of rendering the story once, I actually rendered it twice in different wrappers with different themes. It's an interesting idea. However, there are some implications because, for instance, elements that float on top of the whole screen, like a model, they will float on top of both stories, right? Because they are not inside iframes, so it's not 100% contained. And also the interactions, they might fail because now you're trying to interact with one button with specific text or label, but actually there are multiple now.
I tried that already with side by side and it failed, and it's like, okay, I'm stress testing it too much. Okay, I'll pass my time to Ronan.
Thanks. No, I thought of something with that question. So like, the way Storybook starts really plain, as you say, and then you augment and you add stuff to it. Are there schematics? Have you created schematics for Angular to to do this? You know, just add automation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually,
Maybe they already exist. I'm not sure.
Actually, in terms of schematics, we don't have any schematics from us. I do know the NX team, they have been working on their Storybook integration, and that actually contains quite some schematics. In fact, if you're using NX in your monorepo project using NX and Storybook, they provide ways to automatically migrate stuff for you by using their schematics. And in Storybook, we don't. But at the same time, we do have a different functionality. We call it auto migrate, which we are including in this release, actually. And that basically helps you to migrate older code. So whenever we make API changes, we know that it's pretty frustrating having to change code whenever there's a new release. So we want to do that for you. And essentially, there are multiple checks and things that already are done automatically for you. For instance, if you're using Angular 12, you should use the Webpack 5 builder. And this is not something that you should necessarily know, because Storybook knows that you have to do that. So Storybook does that automatically for you. But in terms of adding functionality like this multiple themes thing, I don't think it's the best idea to automate that, because it's such a very specific scenario that really depends on how you actually set up your components, what kind of library you're using for theming, what kind of themes you have, and where they're located. There are so many things which is difficult to build a heuristic upon. Then yeah, I wouldn't really see that kind of automation happening. However, that's the reason why add-ons exist, right? They essentially abstract all of those things away from you and provide you a simple usage API for that.
Thanks. Makes sense.
That's a nice wrap up, I think. We have 2 more minutes, and thanks again, Yann. Today's office hours were very amazing, really. Possibly one of my favorite ones. And what else to say? There's just one more office hours this year on December 22nd. I'm going to create the event soon, so you can join it. I hope you want to join it. And yeah, what else to say? Bonnie, have I forgot anything? We have this ceremony. What was it? Saying thanks, right?
Yeah, that's the best part. Well,
yeah, okay,
not in this case. In this case, the presentation was the best part, but it's
so let's all say thanks to Yann, and then we close the meeting. And
yeah,
have
thanks
a nice
for having
evening
me.
or morning or whatever time zone you are in.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yann.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yann.
Thank you, Yann. Very good.
Thanks, you too, Kai.
Thank you, Yann. Thank you, Kai.